Good. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. The Honey Farm. Free retreat for artists, writers, thinkers. Can't work in the city? Come to the artist colony and also learn how to keep bees. Start early May. Contact Cynthia. Just as the queen of a hive is nothing without her workers, Cynthia knows that her honey farm cannot be kept going by herself and her assistant Hartford alone. She places that ad, receives 12 responses and accepts them all. Among them are applications from Sylvia and Ibrahim, aspiring writer and painter respectively, who in different ways and for different reasons are struggling to leave their childhoods behind and to emerge into the world as fully formed adults. The intertwinings of the lives of the young artists, combined with Harriet Lye's depiction of the lush yet brutal Canadian landscape and her extensive detailed research into bees and beekeeping, conspire to bring Cynthia's honey farm to eerie, uneasy life, summoning what author Adrian Kelt described as a modern-day Eden, shot through with innocence and foreboding, and causing Iain Reid to comment that the Honey Farm offers a thrilling narrative that examines the distorted realities and conflicting perceptions that often exist in the quietest places. Harriet Alida Lye is from Richmond Hill, Ontario. She lived in Paris for many years and was writer-in-residence in this very bookshop for several months. Her fiction, essays and reporting have been published by Vice, Hazlitt, Happy Reader, The Guardian and more. She also founded and edited Her Royal Majesty, a literary arts magazine that ran for 6 years. She now lives in Toronto. The Honey Farm is her first novel. Critics have been swarming to heap pun-riddled praise on Harriet Alida Lye's debut, with Kirkus calling it lush and poetic, adding that each lyrical line feels like a gift left at the reader's altar, a honey-mouthed debut ruminating on creation, possession and faith, while the New York Times was unable to resist labelling it a buzzworthy debut. We should be grateful then that author Lauren Elkin avoided that particular temptation and simply declared, "I loved this book." Please join me in welcoming Harriet Alida Lye back to Shakespeare and Company.
It is so wonderful to be here, and I'm just so grateful to Shakespeare and Company for everything that they do to create this incredible community. I first arrived in Paris and lived here, and I moved here 10 years ago, 11, and I started working at the bookshop 10 years ago. And 7 years ago, I lived here for 3 months. Sylvia gave me the writer's room, and I finished writing the novel here. And what they do in creating a community of people who love literature and who read literature and value it seems like a very simple thing, but it's actually so rare and special, and I'm incredibly grateful to be here and a part of it. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to read from the beginning. The Honey Farm. Listen, it starts with the bees. All day long, the low, throttling hum of movement, the moment of liftoff, the bass note that never goes away. Then, swelling from the sidelines as day falls, comes the digital tick of tobacco-brown crickets, percussion, chick-chicking like an automated sprinkler, chirp-chirping like needy birds. In come the fiddling grasshoppers, strings, from the balcony of trees, birch, poplar, and pine, followed by the lazy, peripatetic buzz of a fly. The high whine of mosquitoes, the fugue, soars above the rest. You will not be able to hear the bees whispering, and you would not understand their secrets even if you could. What you will hear is a hungry, unearthly cringe, the rub of wings as they fly. A science, no, a magic, that you will never know. The sticky slurp of suction, nectar, thirst, sex. It is nothing at all like love. Look. The gluey honey is cracking from the cloud-gray hive bubbling from the branch. It's cracking, too, from the ceiling where the colony has swarmed. Open mouth, blood on the teeth. It starts with the bees, and it'll end this way, too. So the quote that opens the book is from Exodus. "Go up to this land that flows with milk and honey, but I will not travel among you, for you are a stubborn and rebellious people. If I did, I would surely destroy you along the way." Exodus 33:3. The honey farm was in a valley in the northeastern part of the province, not far from the old river mouth. Islanded between Timmins on the Ontario side, La Sarre on the Quebec side, and the Abitibi Indian Reserve to the northwest, the farm was in the middle of a logistical no man's land. The nearest town was Smooth Rock Falls, population 1,316 at last count. Though the region was not particularly known for its agriculture, the farm had always done well. However, that spring there had been a terrible drought, the worst in recorded history. Everyone suffered. The flowers were desiccated. The bees were restless. Cynthia was the proprietor of the honey farm. She'd purchased the land about a dozen years ago. She had worked it and worked hard to make the cold, pebble-dashed plot yield more than anyone would have expected. She kept her dark hair cropped sensibly short, making her neck look even longer. Meeting her for the first time, you might be reminded of a tidy, highly polished operating theater. Cynthia had scatterbombed specially made advertisements in an attempt to recruit extra hands to help during these tough times. The drought had made sand of her soil, wax of her honeycombs. She needed reinforcements. Hartford, her assistant, was not enough. The idea was that people would work for free in exchange for room, board, and life experience. Cynthia had asked Hartford to find relevant blogs and websites on which to post her ad. For the newspapers, she selected only those in cities and large towns, mostly the provincial capitals and their peripheries, and none in the surrounding area. Nobody from the villages in the region could be fooled into such a scheme. The ads promoted the farm as an artist's retreat with a bonus, a chance to learn the apicultural trade. Applications started trickling in immediately. We've had 12 so far. Hartford hovered in the doorframe of the honey house, wood-paneled, warmly lit, not wanting to disrupt Cynthia at work. Terrific, Cynthia said without turning around. Let's take them all. She put down the jar of honey she'd been labeling and turned to reach for the stack of forms Hartford was holding. They don't have any experience. What did you expect? She laughed. At least artists don't expect to get paid. She took a large swig from an unlabeled beer bottle. This drought is only going to get worse. We'll need all the help we can get. She started flicking through the papers, searching for something. She didn't yet know what. After a moment, Hartford said as a last resort, "But where will they sleep?" "You'll clean out the rooms up in the attic and we'll get futon mattresses from that place. You know, that place in Timmins filled with junk?" "No, I'm not sure. Oh, come on, Hartford. The second-hand shops filled with evangelists where you can buy old tea towels and household... I really don't... The Salvation fucking Army. Yes, that's it." Cynthia's eyes were slightly farther apart than was proportional, and when she became angry, her eyeballs bulged and her likeness to an amphibian grew stronger. They stood quietly, Cynthia a little drunk, Hartford a little afraid. "Where's the 12th?" Cynthia asked, flicking through the pages. "Oh." Hartford reluctantly handed over the final form, including the optional photo the applicant had chosen to send in along with the paperwork. He'd held it aside for reasons he was sure Cynthia would understand. "A writer from Halifax, but she doesn't seem to have much," he faltered, found his feet again. "I mean, she's not published or anything, and as it's so far away, I didn't think she'd want... That's her choice, isn't it?" Cynthia spoke lightly, and then her eyes landed on the photo. "I see," she said, her voice changing. "Well, it will be good to have more people around." She stared at the photo. Hartford stared at her. There used to be a river that ran into the valley. The remaining conduit still rippled with now frozen fluidity, the memory of its function forever dictating its form. This was thousands of years ago. Now there was no water, there were wells. These days, the river bypassed the region entirely, and instead of riffling around the north, it diverted directly south, towards the center of the province. In the old hollow where the river once ran, ridges of sand drew topographical maps in the weedy ridges. Fish had had to grow legs, becoming salamanders, newts, and toads. The word amphibian means, etymologically, both sides of life. The town had not yet accommodated this season's sudden drought. Patterns hadn't changed. No research had been conducted into ways either to find more water or to use less. This was partly because there was still hope, but primarily because the infrastructure did not exist. Wells, like habits, run deep. Cynthia was intent on changing this.
Thank you. Listen, it starts with the bees. I'm curious about if it did start with the bees for you. I mean, the behavior of honeybees, their actions, the way their communities are shaped is fundamental to the book, both on a sort of a literal level. Obviously, we get to know about the workings of the honey farm, but then you also use it in many different ways to kind of either shadow or to parallel with some of the human dynamics that were underway. So I was just wondering, could you talk to us a little bit about the genesis of the book? Did it begin with an interest in honeybees, or did the interest in honeybees come from the interest in these kind of group dynamics?
Well, it came with the title, The Honey Farm, actually. Okay. And I went to a family friend's property in the Loire Valley with some friends of mine, and she keeps honey, and we didn't do anything to do with the honey, but I mentioned when I was running that magazine, Her Royal Majesty, the poetry editor was like, "Oh, The Honey Farm, that sounds like a good title for a short story." And so it's interesting that you asked, did it start with the bees, because it started with both at once. The honey farm in my mind became this artist's residency, and they did have a symbiotic relationship from the beginning. So it was bees and artists on this farm. So the farm was very much the setting that I could visualize. And from the honey farm came from the idea that I started thinking about that biblical quote that I opened the novel with from Exodus, the land of milk and honey, and the tone of that passage being so ominous, like it's an omnipotent God speaking, and in Exodus, as in the novel, there's all these sort of natural events. Sylvia considers them perhaps plagues, and so it evolved very much from the tone of that, and that's how the character of Cynthia developed. So while Cynthia we never get in her head, and she's not really the main character, she's the underpinning for it all. So her running this farm, it all did sort of come together at once.
Okay. You've touched on quite a few elements that I'd like to explore throughout this conversation, but let's stick with the farm for a moment. So the title came from a visit to a farm in the Loire Valley, so in France, whereas, of course, this you've transplanted the action to Canada, and to a very, it strikes me, specific part of Canada, like from a point of view of landscape. Now, that's something which you evoke very clearly in the book. I was just wondering, for people who aren't particularly aware of the geographical and geological layout of Canada, could you give us a little bit of physical context?
Yeah,
of where
well,
the
I
farm
actually
is set?
just drove all across the country with my partner and our dogs, and so I have a much greater sense of the physical landscape of the country than I did before. But the novel is set in a northern part of Ontario, quite farther north than anybody lives. Like 99% of Canada live much farther south of that, very close to the United States border. And this is about 10 hours farther north than that. And so it's incredibly isolated. And I did initially think of setting this novel in France, but I didn't want to write an expat novel, and it would have had to be that, because I didn't want it to be I couldn't make a French novel. And it was very important to me that it be from Canada, because that's where I'm from. Someone once said, like, "Oh, well, how long would it take you to switch this to be set in America? Because maybe it would sell better there." And I was like, forever, because I can't do it. And I think that what you get in Canada that I don't know anywhere else you can get is an incredible feeling of isolation. That does come in. It's a very important element of this novel.
It's just the moment you said it's about 10 hours north.
Yeah.
Of there. So I think there's
like
someone with a European
Russia
mindset.
if you drove. Yeah.
And it's also a place of sort of climactic extremes.
Yes.
I get the impression as well. So it's sort of capable in the spring and summer of supporting sufficient wildlife for the bees to exist and to produce honey, but then with incredibly dramatic winters as well. And I was just wondering, did you when you decided to set it there, and knowing that the seasons kind of evolved in the way they did that have an impact on the story as you conceived it, and the sort of the evolution of the characters? To
be honest, that's most of Canada. Okay. It has this kind of dramatic, very dramatic differences. But it was important for me that it be a real place. So Smooth Rock Falls is a real place, but I didn't think that very many people, like it literally does have that population. So very few people have heard of it. Very few people have been to it. So I wanted it to be a real place that existed in the abstract for most people. And I also wanted it to be of equal distance between the nearest English-speaking town, the nearest French-speaking town, and the nearest indigenous reserve, which it is.
It's also a very evocative name as well, Smooth Rock Falls. It suggests something without giving too much away. In a sense. I'm fascinated actually to find out that it's real. I kind of assumed that it was invented because it fits so nicely with the kind of the setting.
Yeah,
the setting
thank you. I thought that too.
Let's talk a little bit about the characters. So you talked a little bit about Cynthia, and we heard from Cynthia at the beginning. But as you say, for the most part, we're not in Cynthia's head.
Right.
For the most part, the action moves between Sylvia and Ibrahim, who I guess are two principal protagonists, although I'd say in a way that Sylvia is probably the main character if we had to isolate one. So would you be able to just introduce Sylvia a little to us, since we didn't hear from her?
So Sylvia has just graduated from university in Halifax. She's lived at home throughout that time, which is fairly common. Her parents are very Christian, and she really has desires to be somebody in the world, but she's not really sure what that means yet. And so she wants to be a writer, she thinks, maybe, and because she's been shaped very much by her parents, who introduced her to religion and which shaped her very much, but she wants to break free from that. But I think she's still this very green character who ends up being shaped by everything else. So she's very shaped by Cynthia, who becomes a sort of mother figure and also a mentor, because she's a published poet who's like published by this chapbook thing that nobody would have ever heard of probably, but she's like, wow, a poet. and Cynthia has a lot of power to be running this place, but Sylvia, she's very impressionable and kind of like naive and gullible, and that makes her quite fearful. I think that you really, for doubt to have an impact, you have to really believe in something. And she really does.
There was a moment in the early chapters when she reads the advert online and is trying to decide whether she should apply or not, where you write that she wonders if she has the right to participate in something like this artist commune on the honey farm. And I found that a really interesting turn of phrase, actually, to sort of, and I think in many ways is one of the forces that can be very paralyzing for young people, actually. Sort of like, particularly if you're not from an artistic milieu, as Sylvia isn't, you have this sort of sense of, is it a world that I'm allowed into? Is it a world that I'm allowed to crack? Whereas I had the feeling that with Ibrahim, it's maybe less of a concern for him.
Right. He doesn't come from an artistic family at all either, but he just does it. He gets canvases, or he gets cardboard that he picks up on the ground in Toronto. He scavenges at night, walks the city as an insomniac, and takes these cardboard structures that he turns into canvases, and he makes a way for himself that feels very natural, and he has never thought of selling it, but that doesn't make him, like, they have a conversation where Sylvia's like, oh, well, you're a real artist. He's like, well, what makes me real? And she's like, it's just funny to me that he doesn't question it, whereas she does. And I think you can be a legitimate artist without questioning it, and he is. And I think that the right to participate is something that I think, as you say, must strike many writers and many artists in general. But he has an ease that she does not.
Yeah. And it is something we notice kind of as the book progresses, as they get to know each other better. There's sort of like there's almost this sort of permeation between their two characters. Obviously, the time they spend together, they have this influence on each other. And of course, the sort of the triangulation of their friendship, of their relationship, is Cynthia. Now, you described her as a kind of a mother figure to Sylvia, but of course, Sylvia has a mother, as you talked about, her parents, who are quite afraid for her to go off to sort of participate in this commune, and it struck me, partly because of the biblical references, which we'll come on to, that there's a sort of in a sense, perhaps her mother is a kind of a Mary type figure, whereas Cynthia, I was wondering if maybe sort of like a kind of more of Old Testament figure, something along the lines of perhaps Lilith or Eve. And I was just wondering, was that a way when you were writing it that you conceived it?
No, but I love that interpretation. Yeah, her mother isn't very present in the novel. They don't come to the farm. She has two phone conversations with them. But Cynthia I think Cynthia is quite insidious, and whether or not she's malicious is up to I think different readers interpret it differently. But whatever her grand plan is, I think is opaque because we never get in her head.
Sure. And concerning the so again the sort of the triangulation of the relationship, because of course Ibrahim lost his mother as well when he was quite young. So again, did you have the sense that, as you were writing, that Cynthia was again stepping in to that role a little bit?
It's more like she's the queen bee. So she's a mother figure because she's like the mother hen. Like she's keeping everything in line. I don't think that she's a mother figure to Ibrahim because he doesn't need a mother. But for Sylvia, who is she feels quite isolated and not abandoned because she wanted to be there, but I think she's looking to outside circumstances, whereas Ibrahim has what he needs within himself.
Let's talk about the bees, because I mean, you just compared Cynthia to the queen bee there. One of the things that really sort of leaps off the page is the detail of your research into honey production, into honeybee communities. Was your visit to this farm in the Loire your first kind of contact with that world? Or?
No, and we actually did nothing to do with the bees. Like I'm pretty sure we didn't even see the bees. We saw the hives in the distance and then like had wine and lunch. But my mom was the director of communications for the Canadian Honey Council when I was growing up. And so we had quite a few visits to honey farms, and we actually had a 1-800 line to my house, like 1-800 queen bee kind of thing. I can't remember what it actually was. And she managed, this was before the internet, so she managed the communications between the beekeepers and published the newsletter.
Okay.
So I do remember going to, like, Southbrook Farms was a place near where I grew up, and just looking at the hives. I was quite young, but I would always try and find the queen. And the magic of a hive is really palpable. Like when you look at it, you're like, the bees made that honeycomb, like, and they just knew how to do it. And as I researched the bees, I found so many connections to the Bible too. There are very, like, honey being a kind of godlike ambrosia, and also a mystery of sorts, because even though we know how honey is produced, there are certain elements that can never be reproduced.
And also, it strikes me that the bees are this mystery, but they're also, we seem to be finding out they're increasingly vital to our survival.
Yes.
As well. I mean, you see these kind of reports, they come around quite regularly, that sort of about honeybee population and bee population, and how if it drops below a certain point, it essentially means apocalypse for the human race, which again then links us back to the biblical references.
Yeah, totally.
And it's just interesting how sort of as a sort of a cultural presence, bees have been around.
Yeah. Well, the colony collapse sort of started in around 2012, I think, or it was reported the most in 2012. And that also was a mystery. Nobody had any idea why the bees were disappearing en masse. There was no predators found. Their bodies were never found. So that has kind of tapered off. But yeah, the quote attributed to Albert Einstein, I think, actually comes from a bee scientist called Maurice Maeterlinck. And if bees disappeared from the surface of the earth, man would have 4 years left to live. That's what is said. So it is quite apocalyptic. Yeah, and let's stick with this concept of the apocalypse. So the quote that you, I mean, because there is this very portentous feeling which builds as the book progresses, and you mentioned there are these signs. There are certain events that happen, which we won't maybe go into too much detail because we'll leave it for people to discover as they read the book. But that Sylvia at least starts to assume signs from God because of her religious upbringing. Yes. But one thing that fascinated me is in a sense, Sylvia is Christian, I assume Catholic, if I remember rightly, and yet the biblical references are very Old Testament. And I was just curious, was that sort of a sign of her kind of retreat away from, like the first sign of her retreat in a way, from her
her Christian upbringing, sort of into this older, more sort of primeval
I think that
religion.
Like most Christians would be familiar with the Exodus part of the Old Testament, at least, and the plagues, but that wasn't an intentional reclusion kind of thing. I don't think that the reclusion happens right until, if there is one, I don't think it happens right until the very end, where she sort of realizes that it might be. But all of the events can be easily, they're very apocalyptic, but they can also be easily dismissed. It's like, okay, there's frogs. Like, there's always frogs. Frogs happen in spring. It's like, it's nature. But it's also, she starts to fear, like, is it maybe climate change? Or the other characters try and think, like, oh, are you so afraid because you think it's climate change? Which is also quite apocalyptic.
Do you think Sylvia's reactions, because there are moments where sort of she reacts quite badly to certain things. She'll try and speak to some of the other artists living there and try and get them on side to the idea that there might be a sign that stuff might be going wrong, and the others are very dismissive of this as a possibility, and the others are broadly a little bit older than her as well, and I was just curious if this kind of, I'm not sure if melodrama is quite the word, but this quite dramatic reaction that Sylvia has. Do you think that's as much to do with her age as it is to do with her religious upbringing? Like, perhaps a period we all go through.
But I think that she's also quite young for her years, because she hasn't experienced much of the world. She's still sort of figuring it out. And as I said, like, when you really believe in something, everything becomes significant. So she's now all of a sudden considering what she believes in a different way. But yeah, she definitely does react. She overreacts perhaps to certain things, which then snowballs into a greater and greater sense of doom for her.
And of course that could in a sense be connected to her creativity as well, because whereas one of the things that is quite constant in the book is that Sylvia is almost avoiding writing, in fact, whereas Ibrahim finds the honey farm a very productive place to be. Sylvia seems to be almost looking for any excuse not to write,
and just thinking, like, what could I possibly write? And I think that thing you quoted at the beginning of, do I have the right to participate in this? I think that haunts her throughout. But a friend of mine pointed out, like, well, since we see most of the world through her, the world that we're experiencing is from her eyes. She very much is a writer in the way that she processes things and makes parallels and connections. And I think that there is hope to that also.
Yeah, there's just that sort of that extra step for her to make, which, as we said, like, Ibrahim doesn't suffer from. And there are these scenes where he paints Sylvia. And there's when in your biographies it talks about that you have been a life model.
Yeah, those painting scenes were my favorite to write, really. Yeah.
Could you just talk to us a little bit about that experience of being painted, and I think particularly from the perspective of a writer as well, like how that interacted with your own practice?
Well, I think that for Sylvia too, she takes as she's struggling with whether or not she is a creative person or a writer, she does take some kind of solace in the fact that she's participating in a creative act just by being there, but also by being by posing for paintings by Ibrahim. And there's a lot of conversation around women as like objects when they're being painted, and in certain time periods that was definitely the case. But in my experience, like being painted by friends of mine, it feels very much like a collaborative creative act, and it's a really special moment where we can talk or not talk and kind of compare it, like think of the differences between painting and writing, and both are creating something from nothing, which I think is, and through a particular perspective. And for Sylvia, I think that she's kind of questioning her existence throughout all of this in this, what becomes a bit more of a fundamental way. And there's both a relief and a fragmentation that comes from seeing her portrait that's been completed by somebody else. It's like, oh, I exist, but like, whoa, I exist in so many different ways.
And also interesting, as you said, that sort of participation as well, because as someone who has never had his portrait done, I was interested in the way you wrote about it, because we feel that participatory effect. You know, it feels like a collaboration. So, because I would have imagined that sort of having your portrait drawn would be something quite passive. You would be there. There wouldn't be that much interaction. You know, maybe you would talk, but you wouldn't necessarily be having much of an impact about what appeared on the page.
And sometimes that's the case, and sometimes people will just take a picture and then paint from the picture. But either way, I think the truth is that artwork wouldn't exist without you. And so it could be someone else, but in this case, it's you. And so just by that nature, there's something collaborative about it. And yet, like, how often do we go to a museum and be like, oh yes, it's the portrait of like this person? It's like, no, it's the portrait by Degas of that person.
And just
so they kind of disappear.
To sort of expand on that sort of collaboration and participation. So there's something not necessarily cynical in Cynthia's kind of motivation for inviting the young artists to be on the honey farm. But in a piece that you read, she's sort of saying, at least you don't have to pay artists. But on top of that, like so. Between an artist and a model, there's this kind of collaboration and participation. Do you think there is something fundamentally sort of productive about a group of artists, a group of people who are either creating or want to create, sort of living together and sharing their life?
I think in an idealistic way, yes. I think that it could work really beautifully, but I think that also...
That's quite a caveat, yeah.
like
in reality?
Well, I mean, there's going to be drama because you've got lots of egos at play, probably, and competitiveness, and I think that if there's the stakes can change for different people. So I think... At the honey farm, I actually think it works quite well, the community. There's not a sense of competition, really. And the community is present, but it's not overriding anything. But nobody's really making any art except Ibrahim.
Because they're all working really hard.
They're all working really hard, yeah.
That's one of the things that struck me while reading it, was how much work actually it involves. It's sort of, again, like with this sort of idea that I had going into it, sort of it's great actually running a honey farm, because you kind of let the bees do the work and then you harvest what's left, and that's...
Right. Well, in some situations it would be that. It would be a lot less upkeep, but in this particular novel she gets them to do a lot of stuff, in addition to the farm work as well as the beekeeping.
There's a moment where Sylvia is remembering a drama class she had when she was a teenager, and she says that all characters can be... Their motivations can be defined either... Hang on, I'm going to check. It's either love and power or sex and power. Hang on. Which? Love and power.
Love
and power. Okay.
Yeah. Sex is power, maybe, for some people.
Okay. To be discussed. And I just thought that was an interesting thing to put in, and I wondered if it was kind of a nod from the writer as how you approached your characters, actually. I mean, as whether you divided them as into those who were in pursuit of love and those who were in pursuit of power.
Kind of, but I did do that. Like, very little of this novel is autobiographical, but that is a reference that came from a high school drama class that I did.
Okay.
And we did have to... It was called your overriding motivation. So in each scene, you might have a different motivation, and how it can be interesting to subvert those. And I do think that when you look at most characters, and perhaps most individuals, it can be divided by either one or the other, and it can be interesting to subvert them if it's a stereotypical character or archetypal character, rather, like Juliet, for example.
Course, yeah.
But I think that Ibrahim is the only character. I think Sylvia is motivated by power over herself. She's trying to gain some sort of power over her own domain, and Cynthia has power on the mind, obviously. And I think Ibrahim, one critic in Canada pointed out that Ibrahim is the only character who's really motivated by love, and he's the most ineffectual.
Wow.
Yeah.
We'll just leave a little ellipsis after that. And so I wonder, from your perspective as a writer, but particularly when you have a book where there's quite an ensemble cast. So of course you have Sylvia and Ibrahim in the foreground, you have Cynthia, Hartford, and a few of the other characters are a little bit more forward. But you have a cast of, I guess, 10 or 12 or 14 characters we get to know throughout the book. And I was just wondering about your process of getting to know them, and how the characters evolved, and also how the story evolved, because you told us that the book began with the title and this concept of a honey farm, and then maybe this concept of a artistic commune on a honey farm. So was it for you as a writer, did you just think, okay, I'm going to drop in these characters and I'm going to see what happens, or did you have a very clear idea of how their lives their lives at the honey farm would evolve before you started writing?
It was definitely the first. Okay. I'm like, I don't remember. They just always existed. But the there's a French couple, and I remember being like, well, if they're that close to Quebec, and I wanted some French presence, so there's a Québécois couple, and there's generally a demographic like quite that extends a lot of Canada. But no, it wasn't. They don't represent anything in particular, and they're not there for a particular end game from the beginning. It just sort of played out that way. I like Monique, I think, of the ensemble the best.
Why?
She's the most. She's closest to the surface, and she's willing to say the things that she thinks, and she's quite flippant in a way, but also quite deep. I think.
And one of the things that I guess unites all of the young artists that come to the Honey Farm is most of them are city kids, or they've grown up and around cities. We talked a little bit about the landscape, but one thing we didn't really talk about yet is that sort of that confrontation with nature. And the sort of the harshness of nature, the brutality of nature, and how perhaps our presence in nature leads us to do certain things that would perhaps surprise us or disgust us or sort of appall us. And that seems to be particularly for Sylvia something that she grapples with.
Yeah, it's funny because as you said that, I'm reminded of something that we learned in English class in elementary school, I think, which is that the Canadian themes in literature, like as a Canadian, you learn this. It's one of the main ones is man versus nature, and like that's the stereotypical Canadian novel. And I was like, I didn't write that novel, and I'm like, oh, maybe I did. But I think that the isolation is very much a part of this landscape, and the town is situated on what's called the Canadian Shield, which is again kind of like this war-like word, and it's a very deep layer of granite and quartz that's quite impermeable. And when they were building roads up there, they had to put TNT down them and blast open the roads. And there's many parts of that. There's many places in that part of the world that don't have roads or access points and need to be helicoptered in. But I think that the harshness of the nature is something that surprises them all and is exacerbated by the drought that's mentioned at the beginning and the intense heat. Of course. So it is a harsh.
And in a sense, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily put it in that sort of bracket of sort of man or woman versus nature.
Right.
It doesn't seem quite that. It seems more to me that sort of that Sylvia is being confronted with. Particularly Sylvia, I think all of them, but particularly Sylvia is being confronted with this sort of this perceived brutality of nature compared to perhaps the morality of her upbringing.
Well, I think that there is when I can see why people believed that God was evil when if they believed in God in the old thousands of years ago, it's like terrible things are happening. Why? And I have to find some sort of reason from it. And and I think that just looking at the power of nature to destroy, you see that more palpably than you do the power of nature to create. In most cases, I think, when you see destruction like a tsunami or an earthquake, and you see or even just on this road trip, there was this one point that was a confluence of two rivers, and I was just like, if anything dropped in there, it would get crushed just by the power of the water. And the water's ability to carve through this Canadian shield is incredibly impressive and scary.
But that's it. It's scary, it's impressive, it's appalling. But at the same time, we find Sylvia drawn to it a little bit as well, right? Would you say? There seems to be some sort of attraction to it.
And I think that she is also trying to ascribe this biblical meaning to it also, and then there's many moments where she's almost deflated when she realizes that it might not. There's the water is red and the earth is red, and then when she gets an explanation for what it is, she's sort of like, oh, yeah, it is just that.
It's almost easier to believe that plagues are being visited upon the honey farm than to face up to this kind of natural harshness.
I think that
reality.
Narrative can be a lot easier for some people than no narrative at all.
Which I think is a great point to turn over to you guys. I've monopolized Harriet's time enough. If you have a question, just raise your hand. We will get the microphone to you so everyone can hear you. Don't be shy. Who would like to kick us off?
question over there.
Over there.
Where are you from in Canada?
I'm from Richmond Hill, Ontario.
We're from Hamilton.
Cool.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Hi. I'm from Barrie,
cool.
just North Barrie.
Any Canadians? Any more Canadians in the audience? Cool. Put up your hand.
Nice. As a Canadian, how did you write? How did you decide to go to Paris and write?
Both of my parents are British, so I have a British passport, which I'm not sure what'll happen with that now, but 11 years ago it was very helpful. And I'm really glad to see my friend Jeffrey Green in the audience. He was my first writing teacher here in Paris. He is stopping this year, but he was a poetry teacher at the American University of Paris, and I was in his first class. And I was like writing. I wrote, but I didn't really consider myself a writer in any way. And then in reading the work that I would submit, he was like, "You are a writer. You are a writer. You just have to write." And there was something so liberating about the way that was said to me. It's like, oh, I don't have to change who I am. I don't have to become someone different. I just have to keep on at it. And I think that was other advice that I've heard from other people to other people, like writing advice. When I hear it, I think that the best is just keep at it. Yeah.
Yeah, just there.
Hi. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what it feels like to be a debut novelist. You've written for a long time, you've edited other people's work, and now finally to have your first novel out in the world, and what that feels like, and being here, presenting it at different bookshops and seeing the publicity.
That's a great question. It's kind of uncanny in a lot of ways. And as a debut novelist, there's a million novels. I think in America alone, there's something like 20,000 novels a year that get published, like such a huge number. And so there's no, and then there's some that you hear of and they win all of the prizes and everyone's reading them and it's like the book of the year, but there's all of those other ones. And there's so much, there's so much territory. There's so many books that will be in a bookstore. And it's amazing to walk into Shakespeare & Company and be like, there are so many books here. And how will you ever... It's, again, like, do I have the right to participate in this? But it's like, but they all do, so I do too. So I feel like that's kind of it's like, well, anyone can do it. And so I feel like I can also do it. And it's just an really immense feeling of gratitude to be recognized in any way, like to see when I go into a bookstore and my book's there, or like to get a review, to be like, wow, like people paid attention to it and gave it their time and their thought and then wrote something else about that. So it's just so cool. And the film rights have sold, and that's something that I'm so excited about because I'm so excited to work with the script writers. And like the thing that I think I like the most is knowing that the book lives on in other people's minds and hearts and imaginations. And even if there were only 10 people that read it, that would still be true.
So you mentioned working with the screenwriters. How has that been? Because obviously a book is conceived mostly by oneself, and now to turn the project into something that is so fundamentally collaborative and involves, just an incredible amount of people to make a film.
Yeah, it is very collaborative, but what I think I'm looking forward to doing is surrendering and letting other people bring their skill to telling the story in a different way. So I think that to tell a film, you need so many different skills that no one person has, which is different from writing a book. Like, I was the only person who wrote this book, and I had so many people read it and give me feedback and stuff, but a film, it is collaborative, but you're still only doing one part. And so I'm excited because these producers are letting me work with them and with the writers and give them my feedback. But there were other people who were like, oh, no, that's like a no-go. You just have to totally give it up. But I'm excited to be part of the conversation, but mostly just like on the outskirts of it and seeing the fact that this book is coming to life in these other people's minds. Yeah.
There's a question just at the back there. Lady just there.
Hi. So I just have a quick question about publishing and how to get into it. Just as a debut novelist, did you find any pushback into sort of claiming that territory that you sort of say that like you have a right to be in? I know you had written previous articles. I actually read your one for Vice. That was very good.
Cool. Thank you.
How did you get into the world of publishing, and how did you push your name and your voice?
I started publishing by publishing other people. So I was publishing a magazine and giving voice to people who had not been published before. And it wasn't my intention to ever then use that as a platform for my own writing. But when I started writing myself, I guess I was just a bit more aware of the workings of it. And I think that's something that's, of course you get pushback. You get the thing that you have to have isn't ambition, but resilience, and be willing to put yourself in the face of rejection over and over and over and over again. Even if you get published, you'll still have to face so much rejection. So you just have to be willing to face that. And I think also knowing that if you get rejected by somebody, it's just one person. You know, it's not like the industry. It's just like Jennifer.
Is that a specific Jennifer we're talking about?
No, I just
name and shame. Over there. The two people waving, so...
Can you talk a little bit about how you decide on the ending, how you get to, as you're writing, how you get to that ending?
With this one, it's really interesting because I wrote the book with a different ending originally. And then someone who's a script writer actually was reading it, and he had, from a filmic perspective, he was like, well, the payoff is of a secondary character rather than a primary character. And so we discussed, like, how you'd make that work from his perspective. And then I rewrote the ending, like, the second half of the novel. I just totally rewrote it because of that perspective shift. And that's what I worked on when I was living at the bookshop. So I think that it's a question of trial and error in my case, and editing a lot. So I wrote one path, and then it didn't feel right. And then I wrote the other one, and it felt right. So I didn't plan it from the beginning.
Yeah.
Curious. Oh, sorry. Curious about what you'd said that you hadn't wanted it to be in France to not be an expat novel, and I was wondering if that is something that you thought about, but then thought the expat stuff just would have gotten in the way of your intended plot lines, or if it really had just been Canada all along and you hadn't even thought about it.
That's a good question. I think that it was Canada all along, but because I was living here, the only thing that would have felt authentic to me as an English-speaking immigrant in France wouldn't have been writing about French people doing stuff. It would have been about writing about people like me doing stuff in France, and that would have made it an expat novel. Yeah.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more, if there is anybody.
I think did you still have a question, or did I answer your question already? You had your hand up.
No?
No, okay.
Okay, oh, there.
Hi. Just finished a novel this evening, loved it.
Thank you, wow, thanks.
I was wondering if you might say something about the potential, whether there is or there isn't, allegory, because it felt very much to me, and my mind's still working on what potential allegories are actually going on, all the biblical references. I know Adam's already sort of mentioned this a bit, but I was hoping you might say a bit more if there was something deliberate you were trying to get on there, or if you just use this all as like a framework.
What, one specific part, or this whole just structure?
Well, I don't want to
in
give
general?
anything away about the biblical allusions, but there are some that are very obvious. There's some that are more subtle. And I was wondering if maybe you actually go in somewhere with this. There was like a point you wanted to make, or a particular journey you wanted to echo or show through this.
I think, it's hard to answer the question without giving stuff away, I guess, then. But I think that what I hope Sylvia learns is not to give too much power to any one thing, and that the only allegory I would say is, I guess it's like discovering her own through line within all of these structures that surround her, biblical and artists and the bees. And so I think that it's, I'm hopeful that she finds her own way of doing it throughout all of that. Does that make sense to your question? Okay. Probably won't make sense if you haven't read the book yet, but.
Which is why you should all go in there now, buy the book and read it. You spoke earlier about how the work that your publisher put into it and everything like that, and also we should just comment on what a gorgeous book.
Oh, I love it.
Put together as well, and also not just in appearance, but also in touch. There's something kind of
it's quite matte.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. It's more matte than most matte books. There's something quite extraordinary. But I was just wondering also, like, the design of the cover itself. It was something I think rarely does a book cover sort of really set the tone and set the feeling of what is to come. And I was just wondering, did you have much participation with that, or did they come up with a design and you said...
Well, I can tell you a little bit about the genesis of the book cover. So they initially did a totally different one, and this was done by the American publishers, the design that, and all of the Canadians and the Australians who bought it separately ended up buying the same cover art because everybody liked it so much. But initially it was all lowercase, the title and my name, and it was kind of a pink washed, like filter looking, of 3 people in bee suits with crumbling beehives all around them looking away, and it looked almost funereal. And I was prepared to really hate the cover because a lot of people I know who had book covers were like, just, you'll hate it, you don't have any control really. But I didn't hate it. I was like, that's fine. But my agent stepped in and was like, you have to start from scratch on this because it's called The Honey Farm. We don't need to see a honey farm. You need to go somewhere more tonal with this. And I think she was completely right. And I think that if only because she then provoked the artist and art director. And the artist is someone who I now follow. Her name's Zoe Norvell. She does great book covers. And they came back to me with a few other options, and this is the one that we were all drawn to, but I was a little bit reluctant to use it because I was like, it's flowers, is that girly? And but it's like both. And then I showed it to people who had never read the book, and they're like, but it's beautiful, but then it's so dark. And I was like, oh great, if that's what you feel, then that's perfect. And my only thing was like, would you put a man's name and a man's book title in all lowercase? And then they're like, okay, all caps, everything all caps.
Wonderful. Well, we have stacks and stacks of Harriet's book there. I hope you're all going to take one
and
away
I'll sign
with
them
you.
right here.
And Harriet will be here signing. Do stick around. We will also be serving wine as usual. But please just join me one more time in giving a big round of applause for Harriet Alida Lye. Thank you.
Thank you.